So that brings us very much into the notion of these laws of training. And Zatsiorsky used a kind of series of markers or key headings for us to work from, and defines the first as the main law of training. And the main law of training is really simple to understand. Look, if a training routine is planned and it's executed correctly, you are going to get an improvement in the physical fitness of the body. In other words, you're going to get adaptation. But the key thing is it has to be systematic. It cannot be training on the hoof. You cannot apply training, whether it's for working for high performance athletes or whether it's just somebody who's looking at it maybe in a clinical population group. It has to be systematic. You have to be able to recognize that we apply the training in order to evoke the appropriate biological adaptation, and we do that in a systematic manner. Not the case of where we will in essence just make up the training on the go. And when I've been referring to adaptation already, what we are referring to is the ability of the organism to adjust to the changing environment. So that's really important. Adaptation, we can see it in this example of the image here, at a macro level. You can see we've got large muscles. So we've got the process here, or the outcome here, of hypertrophy. But that adaptation is the function actually of microscopic adaptations. We're getting adaptations at a myofibrillar level, where we're getting changes in the cross-sectional area of each muscle fiber. We're getting changes in hormone concentration. We're getting changes in neural recruitment patterns, enzymatic function, enzymatic concentration. So all of those are adapting to the changing environment. What's the changing environment? The changing environment is fundamentally the notion that you're applying a biological stress. And by applying a stress to the cell or the organism, or if we think about a kind of a more macroscopic level, by applying that stress, we're changing the environment on which that stress is being applied, and that evokes the biological adaptation that we are referring to. And this will become more apparent when we start to get into the models of training. The next law is the law or the principle of overload. So remember that you've got to have a systematic approach to training to evoke biological adaptation. But it's all very well being systematic, but unless you get overload, you will not get that adaptation that we've already been referring to. What does this mean? Well, you only get the adaptation if the magnitude of the training load is in excess of the habitual level. In other words, the magnitude of the training load has to exceed the homeostatic level for the organism which is being stressed. So that's really important. If all you ever do is train at that homeostatic level, you will never get biological adaptation. We have to put the system under stress to drive the response. And so if, for example, you've got, say, a resting heart rate of 70 beats per minute, and you never go beyond 70 beats per minute for a sustained period of time, you're never going to get morphological adaptation of the myocardium. If, for example, you can lift 110 kilos, let's say you can squat 110 kilos as an example, and that's the maximum you can do, but all you ever do is just squat 110 kilos, you're never going to improve. You have to go beyond the 110 kilos to try to evoke the biological adaptation, to get this overload-based effect. And you achieve that by what we dealt with in the previous session, which is by manipulating the volume and the load of the training being conducted. And remember that they are all-encompassing. Particularly load, it encompasses intensity, frequency, duration. And combined in that, of course, fundamentally, you've got the intensity of the session, but it's not just the intensity of the stress being applied in, say, the repetition, but it also takes into account what is happening in the recovery between, say, sets and repetitions. So all of these help to drive that biological adaptation to go beyond the habitual level. And kind of as a rule of thumb and a little bit of understanding, what we know approximately is that the training load of an elite athlete is roughly 10 times greater than that of a novice. Why? Because their habitual level is approximately 10 times higher. They've got to evoke that amount of biological stress to keep pushing the physiological boundaries. If you take somebody who's untrained or in a clinical population group, the amount of stress that we need to apply to go beyond the habitual level is far, far less than it would be with somebody who's highly trained. And we can kind of see that being reinforced here in this schematic. So if we look at the schematic on the, If we look at the schematic on the left-hand side, so what you've got is training days, and then what we've got is load increments. And this is the idea of a progressive overload. And so what they're suggesting is that they've done, say, 4 days of training, and they've gradually built it up, and then they increase the load for the next 4 days, and they increase the load for the next 4 days. That's quite a severe reflection of perhaps what is going on. What is actually perhaps a better representation is what we see here on the right-hand side. And we will deal with this in a subsequent session on the notion of periodization. But what a microcycle fundamentally is, if you imagine a microcycle is a week's worth of training. Just want you to imagine that. So this is in essence 1 month. And here we've got our training load on our y-axis. And we've got this fatigue score here. But notice that what they're doing is they're progressively increasing the training load. And that is the overload process that we were just discussing on the previous slide. They're not maintaining or they're not holding this. They've got to keep stressing the habitual level. But notice, in agreement with what Costell's statement was, which is you've got to have recovery and regeneration, the fourth microcycle is actually lower than the third one. And that is to allow for the recovery process. And the connection to this, as we're going to get into, is fatigue. As you increase training load, perhaps not surprisingly, the amount of biological fatigue, I'm using the phrase biological because it's all encompassing, it kind of includes physiology and metabolic and even neurological, is increasing. As we go into this fourth microcycle here, the fatigue starts to decrease. Perhaps we need to take a note of this fatigue-based response, because that is the key in terms of understanding the biological adaptations and why overload actually works. And we can see this a little bit more in this schematic from Adrian Midgley. And what you've got here is kind of the sequence of events that take place in terms of this overload that we've been thinking about. So here we've got kind of our primary variables of interest. We've got intensity and we've got duration of the training. So the input here is the training status of the athlete. So remember that if you've got somebody who's highly trained, then they're likely going to have a higher training load than somebody who's maybe more clinically orientated or somebody who's just perhaps trying to get fit. So as he's highlighted here, the intensity and duration thresholds have to be at least attained if you're going for maintenance, or surpassed if you're driving for biological adaptation. And that's really important. What those thresholds are, it very much depends on the individual, but that's the habitual homeostatic threshold. It's not the same as thinking like lactate thresholds or lactate turn points. It's the homeostatic threshold that we're trying to surpass. That drives or leads to what they refer to as a chronic adaptive response. And then, as long as we've got adequate recovery, and it's the recovery that seems to be the connection here. So we said about fatigue, but remember the Costal reference is how important recovery is. You will get enhanced functional capacity leading to performance enhancement. So the question is, well, what's the chronic adaptive response? Because remember, we said right at the beginning that the adaptation doesn't take place during exercise. So what is this adaptive response that's occurring here? Well, the key is this is fatigue. What we're invoking here through the training is we're driving fatigue. The fatigue is going to drive the biological adaptation. And the secret to this is understanding that the more fatigue you invoke, the greater the degree of biological adaptation, assuming you have, as Midgley has put here, adequate recovery to compensate for that. So following on, that then kind of brings us to the notion of our next law, this is our third law, and this is the law of accommodation. And this is really quite an important one to recognise. And it's this, look, the response of a biological object, so that's cellular level or morphological level, to a given constant stimulus decreases over time. So if all you do is keep applying the same stimulus, then not surprisingly, the degree of biological response reduces because you're no longer pushing beyond that homeostatic level. So this is where we get to the law of accommodation. By implication, accommodation is the decrease in response of a biological object to a continued stimulus. So the response is high to start with because, and that's on the assumption that you've gone beyond the habitual level, but the response is high. But if you then just carry on applying that stimulus at the same loading, then you're consequently, because you're getting biological adaptation, you're no longer really pushing beyond the homeostatic level, and so that the degree of adaptation decreases, and we become accommodated, we become habituated to that level. We are at our habitual set point. We're accommodated. We're no longer biologically, morphologically, neurologically, physiologically adapting. But it does pose us a problem. And it's a problem we'll deal with in subsequent sessions on periodization in particular, that particularly in elite athletes, we know that elite athletes have to have variable training program designs, and that's fundamentally to prevent accommodation. But at the same time, the program should also be stable. So how is it we're going to have a program that prevents this kind of accommodation and habituation, but at the same time has a stable design to it? So we'll come back to that in subsequent sessions, but it was worth kind of flagging now, particularly in the context of these laws of training. And we can kind of see that here. So you can see here you've got your performance gain. So it's really high to start with. But as we start to go over time, the degree to which the kind of the gain occurs starts to decrease, because fundamentally, if all we're doing is maintaining that training load, we're no longer pushing as high beyond our homeostatic level to the point where we're down here. We're basically back to our habitual level. So as we saw in previous slides, I'm just going to slip back just to show you. As we saw in previous slides, you can understand now why you have to overload. Because by overloading, you prevent the accommodation that we've been referring to. So our next law is the law of specificity. And what does this mean? Well, it fundamentally says this. Look, training adaptations are highly specific, and they have to be viewed in the context of the transfer of training. So what do we mean by that? Well, it's understanding that you have to recognize that what you are doing in terms of the stress you're applying is going to be very, very specific. So if I am trying to increase, say, an athlete's VO2 max, which is fundamentally, VO2 max, high VO2 max is a function of a high cardiac output, and it's a function of a high arteriovenous oxygen difference, a high delivery of oxygen and a high extraction of oxygen at the muscle. So you go, okay, that's what I want to do. Well, if you then go and do, say, sprint interval training, you're very unlikely to evoke big gains in VO2 max because the training isn't specific enough. But if the training was more, say, conventional HIIT, and when I say conventional HIIT, I'm talking about 5 to 3 minute repetitions at around about 90 to 120% VO2 max, then yes, you will start to get changes, particularly in cardiac output, but also some changes in AVO2 difference. But what's the transfer of training? Well, the transfer of training is a recognition, and we've mentioned this in previous sessions. You'll recall in a previous session I showed a Rubik's Cube as an example, and I said you get this interactory effect, and that's absolutely the case. If if I train in parameter X, it's likely to have a transfer of some of its responses to parameter Y. Let me give you an example. If you're training, say, for strength, and I train for strength in a group of athletes, I can actually see that it has effects on their range of motion. We start to see athletes, particularly if they're training for hypertrophy, it changes their range of motion. We haven't trained for range of motion in that example, but we get a range of motion adaptation. That is a transfer of training effect. So you get the specific responses because you've gone in that case for a hypertrophy effect, you're looking for muscle adaptation. But I'm also getting a change in the stretch reflex, which is reducing in a lot of instances the range of motion of the athlete. So you've got specificity and then the transfer of training. And the other thing to go with is just remember that when you're thinking about this from a kind of a sports science perspective, and you're trying to understand actually what is the magnitude of that transfer of training, and Zatz also has a really nice kind of calculation for this to work from. You may also want to look at, there was a paper published by our group back in 2001 on high intensity interval training where we use this transfer of training calculation. But the thing to be absolutely wary of is different exercises have different modalities, and therefore our apps aren't necessarily directly comparable. And that's why using a transfer of training formula, which in essence negates the kind of the variables and negates the kind of the units, may allow you to get to some degree of understanding how much you've had that training transfer effect. So this is kind of the notion of the specificity of training effect. This is from Bomper in perhaps the most widely recognized book on training science. And so here we've got a kind of our standard training load, and we've got two phases. And again, these will be something that we cover in subsequent sessions. Again, this will be in this session on periodization. But we have a preparatory phase, which is what it means. It's kind of where we're preparing the athlete. It tends to be quite a long phase of training. And then we have a competition phase. So what's happening is, across the preparatory phase, you can see that we're increasing the training load until we get to this plateau point. Now what starts to happen is we are going through maintenance. Particularly in competition, if you think about kind of a competitive soccer season or rugby or netball or hockey, they're long seasons. It's very difficult to keep driving biological adaptation. So what you do is you go for maintenance. But because the load is no longer increasing, what we start to see is performance starts to stagnate. And it starts to stagnate because we're no longer pushing beyond that homeostatic level. We're holding the kind of the effect. We're holding that level. So it's kind of a crossover here between specificity and accommodation. And it's also worth recognizing that in the preparatory phase, the training that we generally do is high volume, low intensity, whereas the training we do in a competition phase is high intensity, low volume. So the training becomes very specific to the domain of training that we are actually working in. So in other words, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. Which then brings us to the next law, which is the law of individualization. And I suppose this is one that we're perhaps more aware of, but perhaps don't necessarily always apply. And that's this. Well, look, the same exercise or training methods elicit a greater or a smaller effect in various athletes. If you look at the session on training intensities and frequencies and durations, we've showed data which was the notion of individual responses, that some people get large biological adaptation, some people get either no gain or actually get negative effects. And that is absolutely, something you have to take into account, and it's driven by genetics. It's both genotype and also phenotype-based effects. And you have to recognise that people and athletes don't respond to the same training loads in the same way. And so when we're talking about training, you have to think at an individual level. Now that's quite hard to do when you've got a large group of athletes to work with, but you cannot assume that the same training method will have the same effect on all athletes. All athletes are genetically very similar. What changes, as we've already talked about in previous sessions, is the genetic expression, the allelic expression. So what you end up having is athletes respond either at different rates or at different magnitudes. That is the notion of individualization. So generic training programs should be adopted and used with caution. Now, there is absolutely a case for using them, particularly with large groups of athletes, particularly in children. You see these being used, but again, even with children, you have to be careful. Children are highly susceptible to training effects. So if you've got a group of athletes and you're training them, perhaps according to the kind of the best athletes in the group, the children who are the less physically fit, the less biologically well developed, will actually find that training far, far harder than those athletes. They'll be working far, far harder above their habitual level than the better athletes in that group. So that you have to start to move beyond the notion of generic training into individualized based training. Now that then brings us to the final part of this, which is the notion of training-based effects. And there are a range of effects. Now, Midgley talks about chronic-based effects in his schematic, but there are a range of effects, a range of responses that we can pick out here. We have acute effects. So an acute effects are those that occur during exercise. So an acute effect during exercise, temperature goes up, heart rate increases, breathing frequency increases. They are acute effects in response to the biological stimulus being applied. They're not an adaptation, they are simply a response. We get immediate effects. So those that occur as a result of a single training session, and they manifest soon after that session. So things like as soon as you stop training, we have to replenish glycogen, or we suddenly get an increase in sweat rate immediately after the training session. We might have a raised blood lactate concentration. We might have a raised heart rate. They are the immediate consequent effects to a single training session. So a single training session on its own won't suddenly produce a hypertrophic effect. It won't suddenly produce, shifts in enzyme concentration. What does do that is the cumulative effect, which is what we get to next. So in cumulative effects, so it's where you're in essence accumulating both those kind of acute and immediate effects. They kind of wrapped up, and the cumulative effects are over the prolonged period of time, and we start to drive the biological adaptation that we've been referring to previously. We also get delayed effects, and those are manifested over a given time frame after a single training session. So the obvious one that you may think about here is delayed onset muscle soreness. We don't experience DOMS immediately after the training session. The DOMS effect doesn't really start to kick in until probably 12 to 24 hours after training. It's delayed, but it occurs. It is absolutely linked to the cumulative effect. It's not an immediate effect, but it's linked to an accumulative effect. But it's different. It doesn't happen immediately, but it does occur after the fact. We then have the partial effects. So these are changes exerted by a single training session. So in other words, a partial effect. It's something that is going to contribute to the overall biological adaptation. So a partial effect might simply be that the athlete is just getting more mechanically efficient from a single session. They're learning the skill pattern. Because they start to develop a better skill pattern, a better movement, locomotive ability, that starts to lead them to become more efficient. So the partial effects start to manifest themselves over time, driving kind of those cumulative effects that we've already listed. We then get residual effects. So in a residual effect, so those are responses that are maintained after the cessation of training. So think about what happens after the cessation of training. What are those kind of residual effects that we retain? Well, that might be 24 hours later, we may still have depleted glycogen stores. We may have reduced phosphocreatine stores. They are kind of the residual effects that we get from training. So all of those together combine the residual, the partial, the immediate, the delayed, and the acute to the cumulative effects of training. On their own, they don't drive biological adaptation. It's the combining of all of those that nets us the gains that we are thinking about, both in clinical and athletic population groups.